Welcome back to Moonlit West, where heartfelt and soothing stories gently guide you into a peaceful slumber. Tonight, I'll share with you a story filled with emotions, life lessons, and the true meaning of leaving a legacy in the hearts of others. This is not just a story to listen to, but one to feel and reflect upon. If you enjoy the content on Moonlit West, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to continue joining me for more memorable tales. Now let your body relax, close your eyes, and allow this story to lead you into the most beautiful dreams. Leaves of Time. Claire Thompson pushed through the revolving doors of an office building in downtown Chicago, her shoulders heavy with her bag and her eyes weighed down by exhaustion. It was late autumn, and the cold wind cut through the crowded streets, but Claire didn't seem to notice. Her mind was occupied with the growing list of tasks she needed to finish before the day ended. At 28, Claire had a steady job in marketing at a top advertising firm, a small but comfortable apartment, and a schedule so packed that there was no room for idle thoughts. Yet she often felt an unshakable emptiness, an elusive sense that she was merely existing rather than truly living. That evening, when Claire returned to her apartment, she found a handwritten letter from her father. In a time of emails and instant messaging, a handwritten letter was almost a rarity. Frowning, she recognized her father's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. Setting her cup of tea down on the table, Claire opened the envelope to find a few short but profound lines. Dear daughter, I thought you should know that Mr. Walker is now at Maple Haven Nursing Home in Maine. He mentioned you and said he'd like to see you one more time. Mr. Walker was a special friend to our family, and I believe you can learn a lot from him, just as I once did. If you can find the time, please visit him. The name Walker immediately unlocked a flood of memories. Mr. Walker had been the Thompsons' neighbor when Claire was a child, living in a modest wooden house in suburban Vermont. She remembered the sunny summer afternoons spent in his garden, listening to him tell stories about history, life, and his adventures. But after her family moved to Chicago, the connection grew distant, and Claire hadn't seen him in over a decade. Sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the words in the letter, Claire felt a spark of curiosity. Mr. Walker, who had been such an integral part of her childhood, was now in a nursing home. Images of him, his silver hair, warm smile, and deep, soothing voice flooded her mind like leaves quietly falling from a long-forgotten tree of memories. Yet alongside the curiosity came a dull ache of guilt. The busy pace of city life had swept her so far away that she had forgotten relationships that once mattered. Was it too late to reconnect? That weekend, in a moment of spontaneous resolve, Claire booked a train ticket to Maine. Maybe I need a change, she told herself. Much of her motivation stemmed from curiosity. She wanted to know how Mr. Walker was doing, but deep down, Claire also sought to escape the suffocating grind of city life and its unnamed pressures. Perhaps, just perhaps, This trip would help her rediscover a part of herself she felt she'd lost. On the misty morning of her departure, Claire, carrying a small suitcase and an old notebook, boarded the train to Maine. She didn't know what awaited her at the end of the journey, but she could feel a change coming, like a fresh breeze rustling through the faded leaves of her life. Session 1, Reflecting on Life. Claire stood before the door of room 14 in Maple Haven Nursing Home, her heart filled with a swirl of emotions. She wasn't sure what to expect. Her memories of Mr. Walker remained but had faded over the years. Taking a deep breath, she gently knocked on the door. A raspy yet warm voice came from within. "Come in." Claire pushed the door open, and the first thing she saw was Mr. Walker, his hair white as snow, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his blue eyes still bright and full of clarity. He sat on an armchair by a large window, a small table nearby holding an open book and a steaming cup of tea. "Claire," he said, his voice filled with unmistakable joy. "I thought you wouldn't come." She smiled, feeling slightly awkward. "I'm sorry for being late, Mr. Walker. Work has taken up all my time." He waved a hand, brushing off the apology. "No matter. I'm glad you're here. Sit down. Tell me about your life." Claire pulled up a chair and began to talk about her work. But as she described the daily stress and exhaustion, Mr. Walker remained silent, his eyes focused as though reading her deepest thoughts. "Are you happy?" he suddenly asked, catching her off guard. "Happy?" Claire repeated, as if the word were entirely foreign. "I don't know. Maybe not." He nodded slowly, as though her answer didn't surprise him. He looked out the window, where red maple leaves fell one by one, silently marking the passage of time. "I used to be like you," he began. "When I was younger, I thought life was a race. As a teacher, I strove to be the best, to gain recognition, to climb to the top. But then," he paused, his eyes growing distant. "I lost what mattered most." Claire leaned in, sensing a shift in his tone. "What happened, Mr. Walker?" "Her," he said, his voice as soft as a breeze. "My wife, Mary. We married young, and she was the light of my life. But I was too busy. When she needed me the most, I wasn't there. Then one day, I got a call, a car accident, and she was gone forever." His voice trembled, but no tears fell. Claire could see the profound pain in his every word, a pain untouched by the passage of time. "I learned a hard lesson," he continued, his voice heavy. "Life isn't about racing to the finish. We don't know what the finish line looks like, nor when the journey will end. What matters is savoring each step along the way." Claire sat silently, feeling something shift within her. She thought about the rushed mornings spent hurrying to work without breakfast, the evenings working late instead of meeting friends, and the weekends lost to exhaustion. "How did you change?" she asked, her eyes full of curiosity. "I learned to slow down," he replied, his voice softening. "I took time to go for walks, to listen to birds sing. I started noticing the small things, the morning sunlight, the taste of a cup of coffee, and I cherished every moment I had because I knew time never comes back." He paused, his gaze locking onto Claire's. "You can do that, Claire. It's never too late to change." His words touched a deep corner of her soul. Claire had never considered that happiness could come from such simple things. Mr. Walker's words touched a deep corner of Claire's soul. She had never thought that happiness could come from such simple things. For a brief moment, memories of her childhood came rushing back, so vivid that she could almost hear her own cheerful laughter on a summer afternoon. "Do you remember what you used to do as a child, Claire?" Mr. Walker suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Claire looked up, her eyes slightly startled. "I remember your garden," she said, her voice filled with nostalgia. "I used to run around the flower beds, and you would tell me to be careful with the yellow roses because they had thorns." Mr. Walker chuckled, a light yet warm sound. "That's right. You loved picking flowers, and every time you got pricked by a thorn, I would tell you, a little pain to learn to appreciate beauty is worth it." Claire smiled, but her smile quickly faded as she recalled a particular day. It was a late afternoon, just after a heavy rain had stopped, and she had run to Mr. Walker's house with a small umbrella. The garden was still wet, and Claire accidentally stepped on a bed of daisies he had just planted. "Do you remember when I ruined your daisies?" she asked, the guilt from that day still lingering. "How could I forget?" he replied, but there was no trace of reproach in his voice. "You cried so much, thinking I'd be angry, but do you remember what I told you?" Claire nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "You said, 'The flowers will grow back, Claire, just like everything in life. What's important is that you recognize your mistakes and cherish them while they're here.'" At that moment, as a child, Claire hadn't fully grasped the meaning of his words. But now, sitting before Mr. Walker, it all became clear. The crushed daisies from years ago weren't just flowers. They were symbols of missed opportunities, people she had unintentionally neglected, and precious moments she had let slip away in her current life. "You've always taught me that, haven't you?" Claire whispered. "To treasure every moment, every small thing in life, instead of letting them pass by." "That's right," Mr. Walker said, his gaze full of affection. "I learned that lesson from my own losses, and I hope you don't wait until it's too late to realize it." Claire lowered her head, her heart full of emotion. His words were not just a lesson, they were a reminder that she could change how she viewed life, starting from this very moment. At the same time, his stories awakened a new desire within her. She wanted to learn more about his life, the experiences that had shaped the person he was today. As she stood up to leave, Claire hesitated and turned back. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice sincere, "may I come back next week? I want to hear more about what you've been through and the lessons you'd like to share." Mr. Walker looked at her, his eyes glimmering with joy. "You are always welcome, Claire. Don't make me wait too long." On her way home, Claire felt as though a small flame had been lit within her, a fresh sense of purpose, as if she were embarking on a journey to find something truly important. Session 2, The Power of History. The following Thursday, Claire stepped into Mr. Walker's small room again, feeling more at ease than the week before. This time, there was no awkwardness or sense of unfamiliarity. Instead, she found herself looking forward to the conversation, as if each visit to Mr. Walker was a journey into uncharted depths she had never explored before. Mr. Walker sat in his usual spot by the large window overlooking the garden, a steaming cup of tea on the table. Claire noticed that today there was an additional item on the table, a worn leather-bound book with frayed corners. "You're right on time," he said, his eyes lighting up with joy at the sight of her. "I didn't want to keep you waiting," Claire replied, pulling her chair closer to him. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Mr. Walker leaned forward, gently placing his hand on the book. "Today, I want to talk about the power of history," he began. "Do you think the past influences you, Claire?" The question caught Claire off guard. She had never considered the past in that way. "I think maybe it does, but I'm not sure how," she admitted. Mr. Walker smiled. "Then let me tell you a story." "Do you know what era I grew up in?" he asked, his eyes gazing into the distance. "I was born in 1944, in the middle of World War II. When I was a child, everything revolved around the war, from the songs on the radio, the whispered conversations of adults who thought I wasn't listening, to the daily shortages we endured." He paused, his gaze slowly drifting to the golden leaves outside the window. "War doesn't just destroy cities, it leaves scars on people, scars that never fully fade. But it was during that time that I learned about the unmatched resilience of the human spirit." Claire listened intently, her curiosity growing with every word. She had never heard Mr. Walker talk about those years. "And then, as I grew older, the Vietnam War began," he continued. "This time, I wasn't just a bystander. I lost some of my closest friends. A few came back, but they were no longer the same. Do you know what that taught me?" Claire shook her head, her eyes fixed on him. "I realized that history isn't just the grand events we read about in books. It's made up of the smaller stories, of people, decisions, and the consequences we live with for the rest of our lives." "What about the women's rights movement?" Claire asked spontaneously, sensing the profound atmosphere. A faint smile appeared on Mr. Walker's lips. "That's a good question," he said, his tone full of admiration. "I remember the 60s and 70s when women began to stand up for their rights. Mary, my wife, was part of that movement. She taught me so much, not just about equality, but also about understanding others. It was Mary who made me see that all great changes start with the small ways we treat each other." Claire sat quietly for a moment. What he shared seemed to open up a world she had never truly considered. She had never thought about how grand movements or historical events could profoundly impact an individual. You know, Claire, Mr. Walker said, breaking the silence, understanding history isn't just about knowing what happened, but about learning to appreciate the present. Every event from the past is a brick that builds the present we live in. Without understanding the past, we're likely to repeat its mistakes or fail to see the value in what we have now. Claire felt her heart grow heavy with newfound thoughts. She began to reflect on her own family, on the stories her father used to tell, stories she had never truly listened to, and on the sacrifices her mother had endured to raise her. She looked at Mr. Walker, her voice faltering slightly. I think I've forgotten to look back. Maybe I've missed many important things about my own family. Don't blame yourself, Claire, he said, his tone full of encouragement. What matters is that you've realized it, and you can start right now. Claire nodded, a mixture of gratitude and regret stirring within her. She realized she didn't just want to hear Mr. Walker's stories. She wanted to understand her own life better through the lens he had opened for her. Can I come back next week, Mr. Walker? She asked, her eyes hopeful. Of course, he replied, his gaze gentle. I have many more stories to tell. On her way home, Claire couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Walker had said. History, she realized, wasn't just a series of events. It was lessons, stories, and the foundation of everything in the present. For the first time in her life, she felt an urge to learn not just about shared history, but also about her own family's history, the things that had shaped who she was today. Session 3, Love and Loss. This Thursday, Claire arrived at the nursing home with a small bouquet of white daisies. She wasn't sure why she brought flowers, but somehow, after 2 conversations, she wanted to express her gratitude to Mr. Walker in some way. His stories weren't just tales, but profound lessons, and Claire felt herself changing little by little. White daisies, Mr. Walker remarked as he saw the bouquet in her hands. I've always loved these flowers. They're pure, simple, yet more resilient than you'd think. Claire placed the flowers on the small table next to his chair. I guess they suit today, don't they, Mr. Walker? Something simple yet meaningful. Mr. Walker nodded, his eyes sparkling with gentle affection. You're more perceptive than I thought, Claire. They sat down, and after a few light-hearted exchanges, Claire noticed that Mr. Walker seemed quieter than usual. Hesitantly, she asked, What do you want to talk about today, Mr. Walker? He looked at her for a long moment before replying. Today, I want to tell you about Mary, but not Mary, my wife, another Mary, my first love. I met Mary when I was 17, he began, his voice soft, as if cradling an old memory. She lived just a street away from my house, and every Sunday morning I would see her at church. It took me 3 months to muster up the courage to talk to her. Claire chuckled lightly. I didn't think you could be shy. Mr. Walker laughed along. Everyone has their youthful foolishness, Claire. But when I finally spoke to her, I realized that sometimes a single moment is enough to change your entire life. He continued to recount the summer afternoons they spent walking down dirt roads in Vermont, Mary's hand tightly clasped in his. He remembered the way Mary laughed at his silly stories and how she taught him to love the little things, the way light reflected on the water or the fragrance of wildflowers. But then he paused, bowing his head slightly as if the recollection brought a dull ache. The war came. Claire sensed the shift in his tone. You were in the Vietnam War, weren't you? He nodded. I didn't have a choice, Claire. Back then, every young man was drafted. When I left, I promised Mary I would return. I swore to her that I would protect our love at all costs. His voice trailed off, and Claire could see the profound pain in his eyes. But war changes everything. I couldn't write to her as often as I wanted, and when I returned after 2 years, Mary was no longer there. Where did she go? Claire asked softly, as though fearing her question might hurt him further. She had married someone else, he said, his voice devoid of bitterness. I couldn't blame her. How could I? I left her alone in a world full of uncertainty and chaos. I couldn't expect her to wait for me forever. Claire felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping into her heart, a profound empathy mixed with sadness. Do you ever regret it? She asked. No, he answered immediately. Because love isn't about possession, Claire. I loved Mary enough to understand that her happiness mattered more than what I wanted. True love is about acceptance and appreciation, even if it means letting go of the person you love. Claire sat silently. Mr. Walker's story made her think about herself, about past relationships, about the times she clung to something that no longer fit, just to avoid facing loss. She began to wonder if she had ever truly understood love, or if she had simply been seeking security. I think I've been too selfish, she whispered, almost to herself. I've always tried to keep everything the way I wanted, forgetting that love isn't about control. Mr. Walker placed his hand on hers, his eyes filled with understanding. Recognizing that is the first step, Claire. What matters isn't what you've done wrong in the past, but what you've learned from it. Love, like life, always gives us the opportunity to grow. As Claire left, the golden sunset bathed the road leading out of the nursing home. Her heart felt heavy but lighter at the same time, as if she had let go of an invisible burden she had been carrying for far too long. Mr. Walker's words still echoed in her mind. Love isn't about possession. It's about acceptance and appreciation. For the first time, Claire felt a strong urge to confront the hidden corners of her own heart, not to fix them, but to learn how to accept them. Session 4, The True Value of Success. This Thursday, Claire entered the familiar room with a more contemplative mood than usual. Mr. Walker's stories from the previous sessions still resonated within her, like seeds of lessons continuing to grow. Today, she saw him flipping through an old photo album, its pages yellowed with time. You're here, Mr. Walker said warmly. Claire pulled her chair closer. It looks like you're reminiscing about the old days. He smiled gently, pushing the album toward her. I always do, Claire, because sometimes the past is the key to understanding the present. He paused for a moment before continuing. Today, I want to talk to you about success. Do you think you're chasing success? Claire nodded slowly. I think so. But sometimes I'm not sure if I'm truly achieving it or just trying to make others believe that I am. That's a question many people don't ask themselves, he said, his voice thoughtful. And I was once one of them. Mr. Walker began recounting the years he had poured all his energy into building his career. When I was young, I believed success was everything. I devoted all my time to work, climbing every rung of the career ladder. I thought that as long as I earned a lot of money and gained recognition, I would be happy. Claire listened attentively, recalling the similar pressures she felt every day. But Claire, he continued, his eyes reflecting a quiet sadness. What I didn't realize was that while I was busy chasing success, I was losing the most important moments. He described the days when he left early in the morning and returned late at night, leaving Mary, his loving wife, alone at home. Mary was always supportive of me, but I took that support for granted, he said, his voice catching. I didn't see that she needed me more than expensive gifts or promises of a better future. She needed me to be there, in the present. Mr. Walker paused, his gaze lowering to his hands resting on the top of his cane. Then one day I got a call from the hospital. Mary had been in a car accident. I rushed over, but it was too late. As I sat beside her for the last time, I realized that everything I had chased, money, fame, meant nothing if I didn't have someone I loved to share it with. Claire felt a sharp ache in her chest. His words were like a mirror, reflecting her own life. The missed dinners with friends, the forgotten calls to her parents, and the fleeting moments she let slip away because of work. So, what is true success, Mr. Walker? She asked softly, as if afraid to break the solemn atmosphere. Mr. Walker looked up, his eyes gentle yet full of meaning. True success, Claire, isn't about what others think of you. It's about being able to look at your own life and feel proud, without regrets. It's living true to your values, to the things you truly cherish. Claire sat silently, her heart heavy yet illuminated. The words values and cherish echoed in her mind. She thought about what she had sacrificed to reach her current position, the long hours, the strained relationships, and even parts of herself. I think I've been prioritizing the wrong things, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Realizing that is the first step, Claire, he said, placing his hand on hers as a gesture of encouragement. Time is the one thing you can't get back. Make sure you spend it on what truly matters. As Claire left that day, the golden sunset bathed the road leading out of the nursing home. Her heart felt heavy but lighter at the same time, as if she had let go of an invisible burden she had been carrying for far too long. Mr. Walker's words still echoed in her mind. Love isn't about possession. It's about acceptance and appreciation. Session 5, Memories and Legacy. That Thursday, the Vermont sky was unusually clear, with gentle rays of sunlight filtering through the golden maple leaves. Claire stepped into Mr. Walker's familiar room, her heart feeling both light and heavy. This marked the 5th consecutive week she had visited him, and she knew today's conversation would be a significant milestone, not only in her journey of listening, but also in her own life. Mr. Walker was seated by the window, the sunlight dancing across his face, making the lines on his skin resemble a canvas of stories. He turned to her, his eyes lighting up as they always did. "Claire," he said warmly, though his tone carried a hint of wistfulness. "You know, every time you come, it reminds me of the days I used to tell you stories when you were little. Time flies, doesn't it?" "Yes, it does," Claire replied, feeling her heart tighten at the profound meaning of his words. "But I think memories like those never really fade, do they?" He smiled and nodded. "No, they don't. They become part of a person's legacy. I want to tell you something," Mr. Walker began, his gaze drifting toward the garden. "I've spent the past years reflecting on my legacy. Do you know how I want to be remembered?" Claire shook her head, her eyes focused intently on his every gesture. "I don't want to be remembered for what I owned, money, houses, or fame. Those things will fade. I want to be remembered for the feelings I created in others, joy, warmth, and the lessons I left behind." Mr. Walker began sharing stories about his family, about his parents who had taught him patience and honesty. He spoke of family dinners where conversations flowed endlessly, accompanied by the sound of laughter echoing through the house. "Claire, do you know what made me happiest?" he asked, his eyes filled with meaning. "What is it, Mr. Walker?" Claire gently asked in return. "It was seeing my daughter smile," he said, his voice catching. "Even if it was just for a brief moment, knowing I had done something to make her life better was incomparable." Claire sat in silence, feeling the depth of his words. She began thinking about her own parents, their quiet sacrifices that had given her the opportunities she now had. A deep sense of gratitude welled up within her. "Do you know," Mr. Walker continued, "legacy isn't what we leave behind when we're gone. It's what we leave in the hearts of others while we're still here. It could be a piece of advice, a smile, or simply being present when someone needs us." He turned back to Claire, his eyes full of love. "You've already started creating your legacy, Claire. Every time you spend time here, listening to my stories, you're not just enriching your own memories, but leaving a part of your legacy in my heart." Claire felt her eyes sting with emotion. She had never thought about life in this way. The endless chase for achievements, the constant pressures, all of it seemed to pale compared to creating meaning in the lives of others. "I think I understand now, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to live just to work anymore. I want to live to bring value to the people around me." "That's right, Claire," Mr. Walker said, his smile gentle yet full of encouragement. Live with purpose. Leave behind things that make others remember you with love. They sat together for a long time that day, saying little. Claire felt that even in the silence, there was a profound connection between them. As she prepared to leave, Mr. Walker watched her with a fond expression. "Claire," he called, stopping her at the doorway. "I'm proud of you, and I believe with the way you're changing, you'll create a legacy worth remembering." Claire didn't say anything. She just nodded, her heart filled with warmth and determination. On her way home, she looked at the maple trees lining the road, their leaves falling like gentle reminders that time is finite. She resolved. Her legacy wouldn't be what she owned, but how she lived in the hearts of others. The final words. That morning, Vermont's sky was gloomier than usual, with gray clouds spreading as if forewarning something ominous. Claire hurried through the halls of Maple Haven Nursing Home, her heart heavy after receiving a call from the nurse that Mr. Walker's health had worsened overnight. She entered his room, her chest tightening. Mr. Walker lay in bed, his body frail and far weaker than the last time she saw him. His eyes, though dimmed, held an inexplicable calmness, one that seemed to say he was ready to face the inevitable. "Claire," he called her name, his voice raspy, yet imbued with what strength remained. She took his hand, feeling its fragility. "I'm here, Mr. Walker. I'm here." The room was silent for a while, save for the soft patter of rain against the window. Claire didn't dare speak, afraid that her voice might shatter the fragile peace enveloping the moment. "You know, Claire," Mr. Walker began, his eyes fixed on hers. "I once thought life was a series of battles, fighting for success, fighting for recognition, and sometimes just fighting to survive. But now, as I lie here, I've realized life isn't about fighting." Claire squeezed his hand tighter, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Then, what is life about, Mr. Walker?" she asked, her voice trembling. He paused, gathering his strength for every word. "Life is about loving and sharing, Claire," he said, his tone soft but heavy with meaning. "Not about worrying, not about struggling. Everything I once fought for, everything I tried to hold on to, none of it matters now. The only things that remain are the moments I loved and was loved, the things I shared with others." Claire couldn't stop the tears from falling, but she tried to steady herself. "You've shared so much with me, Mr. Walker. Your lessons. I'll never forget them." Mr. Walker managed a faint smile. "You are the greatest legacy I could leave behind, Claire. The things I've shared with you, I believe you'll carry them forward to places I cannot go." Claire nodded, gripping his hand as if letting go would make him vanish instantly. "I promise, Mr. Walker. I promise to live by what you've taught me." His eyes softened, and his lips moved faintly, whispering words Claire had to lean close to hear. "Thank you, Claire. You've made my final days meaningful. Remember, love is the greatest gift you can give." Claire stayed by his side for the rest of the afternoon, recounting memories from their previous meetings. Mr. Walker would occasionally nod, his eyes closed, his lips curling into a gentle smile. Night had fallen by the time Claire left the room, her heart heavy, yet filled with a new sense of resolve. The next morning, when she received news that Mr. Walker had passed peacefully in his sleep, Claire didn't cry. She stood quietly by her window, gazing at the maple leaves drifting slowly to the ground, recalling his final words. Life is about loving and sharing, not about struggling or worrying. That evening, as Claire sat by the window of her small apartment, the streetlights reflecting off the raindrops on the glass, she held the notebook she had carried since her first meeting with Mr. Walker. Its pages were filled with hurried handwriting, notes on his lessons, stories, and the emotions he had shared with her. She stopped writing, her eyes scanning the final line she had just penned. Life is about loving and sharing, not about struggling or worrying. As those words of Mr. Walker's felt like a reminder, an indelible legacy etched into her soul. But Claire wanted to do something more, something not just to remember Mr. Walker, but also to remind herself of what she had learned from him. The next morning, Claire visited a small nursery on the outskirts of town. She walked through rows of vibrant green plants until her eyes landed on a young maple tree, no taller than her knees but full of life. Its leaves had turned a brilliant red, a shade that reminded her of the warmth in Mr. Walker's eyes. "This one," Claire said to the nursery owner. "I'd like to take it." The owner nodded and carefully wrapped the tree for her. Claire drove to a small park near Maple Haven Nursing Home, a place surrounded by the large maple trees Mr. Walker often admired from his window. She found a quiet corner near a lush green lawn where the morning sunlight gently filtered through the trees. Claire knelt down, her hands touching the cool, damp earth. She carefully placed the young maple tree into the hole she had dug, her movements slow and filled with reverence. As she packed the soil around its roots, a profound sense of peace washed over her. She stood up, watching the small maple tree sway in the gentle breeze. "Mr. Walker," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I hope this tree grows strong, just like the lessons you taught me. Each of its leaves will be a memory, a lesson I'll never forget." From her pocket, Claire pulled out a small wooden plaque she had prepared. On it, she had carved the words, "Walker's Maple, a legacy of love and sharing." She placed it in the ground next to the tree. As she walked away from the park, Claire glanced back at the young maple tree, her heart filled with a mix of sorrow and tranquility. She knew that, just like this tree, Mr. Walker's lessons would continue to grow, not just within her, but through those she would share them with. That evening, Claire sat down to write about her journey with Mr. Walker, but this time, she didn't use her old notebook. Instead, she opened her laptop and typed the first lines. "I met a man who changed my life with his stories." Claire knew that Mr. Walker's legacy wouldn't just be the maple tree in the park or the memories she carried in her heart. It would live on in the stories she wrote, in the life she chose to live, with love and sharing, just as he had taught her. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story from Moonlit West. We hope the words brought you peace and relaxation, wishing you a good night and sweet dreams. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue sharing more wonderful stories. Sleep well.